He practiced 10 hours a day for 30 years. And he lived with the idea that he would live long enough for his realization to complete, but he died. His teachings never really gelled.
I am joined today by Shobhan Richard Faulds. Shobhan has been actively involved in the Kripalu lineage since 1981, and he held a number of key leadership roles at Kripalu Center.
There was a crucial mistake that was made early on, the idea that the renunciate path was the real path, the one that led to enlightenment. And the householder path was a dumbed down path. In the householder path, it's just an incremental practice. You will get guidance on how to experience the profound depths of your own being through simple breathing, simple meditation, simple embodiment practices. This whole universe could be described as an emanation of love into the field of time and space. This whole world, with all its sufferings, with all its highs and all its lows, it's occurring in a field of energy that is loving. It is safe to feel, it is safe to heal, and it is safe to shine forth as your best and brightest soul self.
Welcome to the Walking of the Path of Love podcast, a space for honest conversation about what it really means to live, to lead, to move through the world from a place of connection to love. I'm your host, Charlyn Anandame Ryman, and this is a place where we can slow down, listen deeply, explore love, not just as an idea, but as a practice, a devotion, a lived path we choose again and again. So wherever you are right now, walking, driving, resting, sipping a cup of tea, I invite you to arrive here, just as you are, connecting in, maybe softening your gaze, softening into earth, expanding into sky, taking a deep, full breath, softening, relaxing your belly, expanding the ribs. Long, full exhale, releasing and landing in this moment together. I am joined today by Shobhan Richard Faulds, and I'm so grateful to walk alongside you in this conversation. Shobhan has been actively involved in the Kripalu lineage since 1981, and he held a number of key leadership roles at Kripalu Center. He's written in numerous books, and most recently, he's written 3 substantive books, which I tend to always have by my side somehow. No matter where I am, there's one or the other along with me. The books are about Swami Kripalu's life and teaching, and they're just a wonderful resource and reference for how we can live on this path of love. So welcome, Shobhan.
Thank you, Charlyn, and thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm always happy to talk about yoga, and especially Swami Kripalu's approach to yoga as a path of personal transformation. A warm hello to all your listeners, and I'm ready to jump in.
Yay, awesome. Well, for listeners who may not know too much about Swami Kripalu, would you describe him for us, not just as a teacher, but as a presence?
Well, Swami Kripalu was truly one of a kind in my experience. He had a childlike innocence and mirth that was just contagious. You could not look at him without smiling. And at the same time, he had a bristling spiritual power, for lack of better words. It was undeniable. And he had these 2 qualities merged together in a very integrated person. So my experience really is I've never met anyone like him. And, working at Kripalu for 25 years, I met many of the luminaries, in the contemporary spiritual movement, and many, apparently enlightened people. And And many of them were very good people and dear people and people that I, resonate with and was inspired by, but none of them were like Swami Kripalu.
Thank you for sharing that. And I've heard that kind of that exuding love, and then also just this powerful presence and I love seeing some of the pictures where he's just telling stories and he's so engaged and involved, and it's just incredible, incredible. Can you share a personal story or a memory that feels really alive in your heart today around, the teachings or your experiences with the Kripalu lineage?
Well, this story builds upon, what I just said of when I met Swami Kripalu and really came into his presence. Because coming into his presence, there was just an immediate curiosity of who is this person and how is he presenting? And he had those qualities that I just described. These, it's almost like a feminine quality of receptivity and love and giving and caring, and then a strong male quality of this spiritual power and, literally emanating off his body. The thing that affected me was I immediately registered this as this man has what I've always wanted. He was the first person ever in my life who was displaying this yearning that I had, that, I had lots of teachers in school, of course, and college professors and friends and all sorts of individuals who I interacted with, but none of them were operating on the level that I felt that I needed to in my life. And when I saw it in Swami Kripalu, my response was literally, my God, this really is possible. This yearning I feel to express my soul in life in a full-hearted fashion is possible. And that really set me upon the path of yoga.
What were your first initial steps? Because that had to be like, oh, okay, this is what I want. Now, what's next? Because I think so many of our listeners, and I know for me, a lot of times my question is like, what's next? How do I know what's next? How do I know that next step? And what did you do? Like, what was your next thing to do? Because it's like, wow, what do I do now? I know that this is what I want, and now what?
Well, that's a very good question. So I literally met Swami Kripalu 2 days after walking across the stage and getting my college diploma. And so I had, just graduated from college, and this was the 1970s, and I had a longstanding interest in spirituality and, somewhat alternative things. And I was practicing yoga and meditation to a small degree. I had actually studied at the very end of my college years, after I completed all the courses for my majors. I took a course in Buddhism, and I took an independent study where I studied Hinduism and yoga. So I was somewhat familiar with this whole world, which is part of what, led me to the Kripalu ashram. Even though I was practicing, I was unguided. And I really, my teachers in college were academic professors, who were teaching me about Buddhism as a world religion, and about Hinduism as a foreign culture somewhat. And the minute I saw Swami Kripalu, I realized that this man walked a path to become the remarkable being that he was, and perhaps he can show me how to do that myself. I wasn't so much interested in following him or emulating him as my guru or whatever. I mean, it wasn't that. It was I was 22 years old or 21 years old, and I really needed guidance. Like, what's next? That's what I was. So my next step was I bought the only book of his that was in English. That was my next step. And that night I started reading it.
Oh, isn't that beautiful? Well, and leads us into this whole idea of books. I know when you and I first connected, we really connected right away on this wanting to know more, and wanting to know more both from, a book and an academic perspective, but wanting to know more from an experiential perspective, from the perspective of being a householder, from all these different perspectives. And it's kind of like, well, where do we go? And I love that, you jumped in and started writing books, right? Like they weren't there and there wasn't a lot of information there at the time. But, is that what inspired you to write the books and start writing? Or, what was your inspiration? Because you've just been so prolific in your writing and, and it's evolved over time and it's really just been such a gift.
To answer that question, I have to take you on somewhat of the journey that I went on.
Take us on a journey. That's great.
So the first thing that I did was, I read his book. It was called Science and Meditation. It was the only book in English. And it was a very difficult book. But, I studied it. And I began studying whatever translations of his talks and writings. There were some other books published by Kripalu ashram at that point in time. And I knew, I could tell that he was speaking and living and writing from an organizing vision of yoga. That what he was saying was coherent. But what those principles were and what those visions were was very obscure. So my first writing attempts were solely for me for years, maybe a decade or more, where I was just putting things in my own words, trying to link them together to gain an understanding, the understanding that I needed to practice effectively. And so, some years later, after I graduated from law school and, other pieces, I moved into the ashram and I became a resident. And there's a funny thing that happened there, which was just a little thing. I was in the resident business office and they were starting a newsletter. And they wanted me to word process and format the newsletters. This was just when computers were first coming out in the late 1980s. So I created a template for the newsletter and I included a Swami Kripalu quote at the top. But I had to distill his teachings down to just a sentence or two. And so that was my beginning. I got permission to do that. The person, I had people reviewing my work to see if I was accurate. And they said, I still remember the exact words. My supervisor, his name was Serbi or Wendy Ferran, she said, after a couple months, she said, "You have a knack for this." And
I love that. It does take a knack, right? It's a knack. It reminds me when I started college, my dad said to me, he said, it's much harder to write a 1-page paper than it is to write a 10-page paper. And at the time, as a freshman in college, I was like, there's no way that he's correct. But it is much harder to distill things down, right? And you have such a gift for that. So, all right, go ahead and continue your story.
Well, and so I guess this goes forward to, the current series of books that I've written and, why I wrote them. So I'm not a writer in terms of trying to make my livelihood as a writer. I was Kripalu's lawyer for 25 years. That's what I did. And I'm happy to have done that. And I'm mostly retired at this point. But why I write is because I feel that one of my deeper purposes in life is to not only practice deeply, but to share what I've learned in a way to help other people practice deeply. And so these 3 books that I've written are really an attempt to present Swami Kripalu's approach to yoga, which is very comprehensive in a full-throated fashion. And maybe I'd have to say, yoga in our country is largely taught as a fitness modality. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with seeking health and fitness through the practice of yoga. But Swami Kripalu taught yoga as a path to not only health, that was perhaps his first step, but to psychological growth and to effective functioning in the world, and ultimately to spiritual awakening, to the highest levels of human development, self-realization and beyond. So these 3 books are really my attempt to present, what could be called the Yoga Dharma. And not only to present them, but to present them in a way that there's something that the tradition would call transmission. What does the East mean when they use this word transmission, which sounds like a mysterious word with mystique, and you can imagine gurus raising their hand and giving you a blessing. So there are 3 different levels of transmission. Okay, the first is called transmission of the view, and this is a intellectual understanding of the path that's sufficient to empower effective practice. So this is very sensible. It's like you have to understand in order to put into action. Okay? And so then there's a transmission that occurs at the level of practice, where you can practice effectively, that it begins to take you on a transformative journey. And you actually begin changing. The body changes. You become more vital. The mind changes. You become sharper, and your concentration gets better. Fewer distracting thoughts, and then you begin touching into things that are deeper mind states and deeper levels of consciousness. And that level of transmission of practice will bring you to full transmission, which is the direct experience of what's beyond mind. So I can only say that these books are my attempt to present not my teachings on that, to present Swami Kripalu's teachings on that broad spectrum of transmission, but in a way that Western readers like myself and yourself can really receive that transmission. And I'll make a really bold statement here. I think that anyone who studies these books, not my teachings, not my writings, who studies the compilation of over 1,000 Swami Kripalu quotes. I mean, there's that anyone who reads those quotes cannot but get the spirit and the heart of yoga. And not because I'm a great writer, but because Swami Kripalu left a path.
Swami Kripalu left a path, and it is so helpful to have some guidance around that path. What was emotionally or spiritually challenging for you about writing these books? Because you had to go through these teachings and live with these teachings and find a way of taking that first kind of transmission and making it so that others could get to that deeper knowing.
Yeah, there's a lot that I can respond there, Charlyn. I'll try to make it simple, because this is, this was about a 12-year process. And I was very fortunate to have the time to be able to, practice deeply and write in that way. So there's a little bit of a paradox here, because Swami Kripalu was a gifted teacher, but at the same time, the teachings that he left behind were very, very hard to understand in a comprehensive fashion. Yes. And here's why. First of all, he was a Gujarati speaker. He wasn't an English speaker. So everything that he was written was roughly translated. And even the books that were published were, he couldn't read them in English. He couldn't proofread them, for example. And then in addition to that, there's a big cultural gap. He was a Brahmin. He really was born into mythic India, in the early 1900s. And while he was a modern thinker in a lot of ways, and he was from a definite foreign culture, and it's recognized in the whole field of the transmission of the Buddhist Dharma and the Yoga Dharma to the West, that there need to be what are called cultural translators. That without that cultural translation, the teachings, they just don't land in a way, because they come from a different framework and mindset. The other piece is that Swami Kripalu was a very serious monk and Swami. And, he practiced at a level of, it's hard to imagine. I mean, he practiced 10 hours a day for 30 years. And this was after the first phase of his life, where he was very involved in society and a benefactor and a philanthropist and all these other things. So this last 30 years of his life, he was an intense practitioner. And he lived with the idea that he would live long enough for his realization to complete, and for him to have adequate time to essentially recast the teachings of Dharma, of yoga, in a way that the modern world could get them. And, he attempted to do that, but he died at 69. And I think no one expected that. And the result of that was there was kind of a break in the tradition, and his teachings never really gelled. And so someone had to do that work. And all I can say is I've done my best to do it. And I did it in order to pay back to a tradition that had brought me so much. But you asked me this question of what was difficult. Charlyn, figuring out how all the pieces of this fit together was the biggest puzzle I've ever attempted to solve in my life. And
it was more than 1,000-piece puzzle, Richard. There were lots of pieces, and there were pieces missing, right?
Yeah.
You had to make some of your
anyone who reads the
out.
book, if you read the books, you'll go along on that journey with me. But it came together in the end. I stayed sane. I didn't break down, which was a really good thing. And I feel like in the process, I really accomplished a very important goal for me. And I'm delighted that the books are out there.
One thing that I have noticed in sharing Swami Kripalu's teachings, and especially his stories, is that the stories will resonate differently with different people, and even at different stages in their life. And I know one of my favorite stories is the story about will and surrender and the Narmada River. And I remember teaching this in one of the first programs that I taught at Kripalu Center. And I told the story, and I had the poster that Premal painted with it to tell the story. And for me, I felt like I really knew what that story meant, right? Like I knew what the story meant. So I told the story, I had everyone journal, and then they did pair share. And then I said, okay, does anyone want to share what the story means? And I was astounded at the differences. Like, there's 35 people in the room, and everyone had a different, like, I have goosebumps thinking about that. But that's the beauty, I think, of his teachings and of his stories, that different things resonate with us. And it's not that you say this story means this, and this is what what is needed for you to move forward on your path. We're all at a different place. And for me, when I read the stories at different points in my life, something different resonates with me. And, sometimes my heart feels so light after I read, and sometimes I'm like in a puddle of tears, and it's the same story. It's the same story. And did you find that as you were writing these books? And it can mean something different, and not to make that assumption that what these stories mean had to be a little tricky.
That is such an important question that you asked, because it not only speaks to Swami Kripalu's teachings, but to the broader attempt for people to grow spiritually. So a truly masterful myth or teaching has to be cast in a form where people can read it and derive different meanings at different stages of their self-development. And this is why Christ taught in parables, because those parables can be read by a beginning person, and their response is, I need to be more disciplined. I need to, get serious about this. But that same story read by an advanced practitioner will say, I need to let go of discipline, and I need to trust, in God's will, or trust in, divine knowing or soul knowing. A truly self-realized person can give those teachings. And that's why this book emphasizes Swami Kripalu's teachings and not my teachings. Because Swami Kripalu was able to teach in that multi-dimensional way where, and he's very explicit about it. In the book you'll read, he says different teachings are interpreted differently at different stages of the path. That is why a serious student must read and reflect upon these teachings continually, because new messages will be gained at every stage of growth. So there's something a little bit magical in this. It's along the lines of what Joseph Campbell talked about, when he said the power of myth, that these myths are not just intellectual transmissions of information. They're transmissions of different levels of consciousness.
Yes. Yes. I think too, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, is that the idea of sangha or community is so important around that too. So when we discuss these things, I know for me, I've had some of my most powerful aha moments in having conversations with someone about these teachings. So, it's fine to sit down and read a book or to journal or to pray or to do all my different practices, by myself. And it's also important to have that sangha and the communication and, just having discussions like we're having, and how important is that role of community in this lineage. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, once again, if you look across spiritual traditions as a whole, you'll see that this idea of sangha or like-minded community or fellowship, that it's a universal. And there's a number of reasons, for that. The biggest one is that each of us individually is looking at our life through a particular filter, a particular mindset. And it's very hard to get out of our own way when we interpret things, through very known and often well-worn ruts. But someone else who sees the world differently presents a fresh view to us. And a lot of times that fresh view is startling and helpful and better. But there's also another dimension, which is, so we're social beings. And as social beings, we look for mirroring. We look for other people to reflect our views. And we're constantly somewhat asking, like, am I on track? Does this make sense? And if we simply have a community of what we could call conventional people, maybe you'd think of conventional people like our generic media society, for example. That is not a mindset that's going to lead oftentimes to profound and deep inquiry into the nature of being, into the nature of life. It's going to be like a consumerist mentality,
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're going to do spiritual practice, and if you're going to transform and grow, you need to be held in a community that will mirror back the potential of growth, mirror back the potential for dramatic shifts forward in your life, that will mirror back higher consciousness and then will affirm you and say, yes, you are on the right track. And that doesn't mean that we need to leave conventional society or make it wrong or anything like that. But if you're going to walk a path of transformation, I think the Kripalu teachings are clear that you need to do it in a context of individual practice conducted within a supportive community.
Mhm. I think, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but I think Swami Kripalu talked about, God and spirit and consciousness being reflected in others when we're in this community. Sometimes it's hard to imagine, like, okay, well, what is God? What does God look like? But when we're with each other, we can see, we can see spirit. We can see the oneness that we have, together. And that's so powerful. And one of the powerful things about practicing together is being able to see that, like you're saying, mirroring, and see that in each other's eyes, and feel that together, when we're chanting or whatever, that feeling of oneness that is present, that I don't get when I'm by myself. It's different. It's a different connection.
To take that really deeply, you can look at the actual realization process itself. Now we're jumping ahead, very far on this ladder of yoga, which is what Swami Kripalu would have called it. We're going to the upper rungs of the ladder of yoga. But here's how realization always unfolds. Now that's a big statement to say always unfolds. But and the reason why I'm talking about this is because it links right into Sangha. So the first level of realization is always a personal insight into the nature of self and reality. It always comes first at a level of seeing your own soul and realizing that your own soul is in the image and likeness of God, if we put it in religious terms. Or you could also say in in more Eastern terms, you could say a realization of Atman, right? Of the transpersonal self. And, we're talking something very powerful and not like just an expanded sense of ego identity. We're talking about tapping into something, truly universal. But right on the heels of that insight must come this second stage of it, which is everybody else is that too. And so that's the complete realization. There's actually a third step, which is the whole world is a manifestation of that. So those are the three steps to realization. But without the first one, you really don't have the seed experience that really brings forth a realized soul. Without the second one, you have some kind of megalomania. We have a lot of egos who go off the path, or excuse me, a lot of half-baked practitioners who are good people, but literally go off the path into a delusive state of, I am God, basically.
Yeah.
It's not that that's not true, that I am God, but without the realization that everyone else is God too.
Yes.
And then the third step is this whole world is an emanation of the divine. And that's a complete realization. So Sangha plays a critical role in that.
So what aspect of Swami Kripalu's teachings feels really relevant in today's world for you?
Oh, Charlyn, you're asking a question that really resonates deeply with me in terms of why I worked so hard on these books. And to be honest, I was writing these books also for myself. I really needed to integrate and complete this stage of my life. And but at the same time, I was also serving. I was also, and so all my life I benefited from the teachings of kind of great yogis and great souls. You can think of Yogananda and Autobiography of the Yogi. You can think of Ramakrishna and the great teachings that Ramakrishna left, or Ramana Maharshi and his self-inquiry and teachings of that quality, and I benefited from those. But these teachings of Swami Kripalu are on par with that level. And his legacy was largely lost. I mean, it was just languishing. And I knew that in these teachings was a really modern set of sensible teachings. I mean, it starts with health. Then it goes to just psychological well-being and what's it mean to be mentally healthy and emotionally healthy. And then it goes into how do you be effective in life? And how can you be a real success in your life? How can you accomplish your missions and your aims in life? And then it progresses into the realms of deeper spirituality. And so that comprehensive path, what would have been the correct term, is in a modern format, because modern, speaks to the 20th century, which is when Swami Kripalu was, that's in accord with science. There's nothing that's unscientific or asks you to believe, highfalutin or offbeat things in these teachings. But it literally walks you hand in hand from where you are to the highest levels of yoga. And I think Swami Kripalu's teachings are of a quality that deserve to be known by people who are serious practitioners. And so, that's my fondest hope really is that these books present his teachings in the comprehensive fashion that step by step, that he recommended. So one last piece on this. So one of the critical pieces of me writing these books was sorting out the householder path and the renunciate path. And there was a crucial mistake that was made early on in the Kripalu ashram, which is very understandable. But that crucial mistake was the idea that the renunciate path was the real path, the one that led to enlightenment. And the householder path was a dumbed down path. And it was just the one that led you until a next lifetime where maybe you would be a Swami. Now, I'm overstating that a little bit, but basically that was the teachings. And so if you were a householder, the idea was, next lifetime, be a good person in next lifetime. And the more and more I studied Swami Kripalu's teachings, and I really began cracking the nut of that organizing vision of yoga that I talked about, that I knew that he had, but that wasn't really clear and got lost a little bit in the verbal translation and the cultural translation. As I began cracking that nut, I saw without a doubt that that was a big mistake, and that there was an important difference in the renunciate path and the householder path. The renunciate path was sudden immersion. The householder path was incremental growth and understanding and practice. And so that's what these books attempt to present, the incremental teachings all along the way that take you by the hand, step by step, through the ladder of yoga to its higher stages, versus some gifted soul who's ready to be a renunciate and go to the highest teachings right away, which Swami Kripalu said, not even 1 in 90, not even 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. So I'll let you ask follow-up questions, but that's so important, because this is saying that householder path isn't a dumbed down version of anything. It's just an incremental practice. And that's what I needed. I know that's what I needed. And I'll tell you, that's what worked for me when I really began understanding.
And I think it's so important to communicate that. And I start almost every retreat that I lead with that around the householder path. And just saying that Swami Kripalu was a householder for pretty much half his life.
Yes.
So he lived these teachings of service and of love in the family. And he talks about, like, this is not a picnic to live life from these things. Like, sometimes it would be easier to be in a cave or something. Sometimes it would be easier not to speak, right? Like, but we're in the world and we're speaking and we're living with our family and we're, out in the workplace, and gosh, that's not easy. And like, I could just cry, and this path gives us those tools as a householder. And that's just so beautiful. And that's it makes you just take a deep sigh, right? It's like, oh, good. This is for me too. Like, this is for me, and we can all do this. And the books that you've written really help to outline that and to make it clear. And you don't have to do it all at once. You take little bits and pieces and little things, and then you notice how those resonate with your life and with where you are now. And if you've just had a baby, maybe some of these things aren't going to work, but there's other things that certainly do. And you just got a new job, maybe this doesn't work. But oh gosh, this teaching really resonates with your life right now. And that's just so beautiful. So I think you've answered this question, but I do want to just bring it up to be sure. And so what do you really hope that the readers experience, not really intellectually, but inwardly, when they engage with your books? Like, what is your hope for the readers?
So the first thing is I think that what I would hope is that my writing style and my real emphasis on clarity allow a reader to really learn a great deal from these books. A great deal not only about yoga, but about spirituality in general, about health, about psychological well-being. One of the things that I haven't mentioned is that after I met Swami Kripalu, and there's years involved here, I had to go back to school and get a master's degree in human development to really understand that was a critical part of my journey to understand his teachings. When I got that, it wasn't getting the master's degree, it was doing the studying of human development and really understanding, that broad spectrum of adult human development, that I began saying, oh my gosh, this is all in his teachings,
It's more puzzle pieces, Shobhan, right? More puzzle pieces.
Exactly. I think there's a tremendous amount of understanding. And I brought that, like the context, the framework. It starts from a place that you will understand. What do we all want in life, and how can we pursue it effectively? That's kind of the
Yeah.
way the book begins. But then there's a second level, Charlyn, that's about all the Swami Kripalu quotes, and I think a reader will find in there a real trustworthy guide. His voice, his caring, his degree of of self-awareness of himself and human beings and human nature in general, that reading these teachings gives you a tremendous sense of confidence that these are trustworthy. And that really matters as you begin practicing and going through a transformative process. The last level I would say is that, as a person begins to practice yoga effectively, and I'm not now talking about, some arduous discipline that no one can do. What I'm talking about a reliable, consistent practice over years. As you begin touching into these higher levels of consciousness, which sounds like so highfalutin, but this is a natural process of healing and growth and bringing forth levels that are already fully formed in us. That as that process begins, you will get guidance on how to experience the profound depths of your own being through simple breathing, simple meditation, simple embodiment practices. That's really what I want is I think what Swami Kripalu wanted. He wanted other people to keep the tradition of the Indian sages alive and evolving through having their own experience of the path. So he wanted to empower people's practices. And that's what I want to do too.
Good. Thank you. I want to start to wrap up a bit. We're on a podcast called Walking the Path of Love, and Swami Kripalu says he was a pilgrim on the path of love. In your time practicing and researching, how have Swami Kripalu's teachings maybe changed your understanding of love?
Well, that's a big question, and I'm going to answer that question. And to do so, I'm going to start with the practical, and go to the, I don't want to say the far out, but the beyond the conventional, the post-conventional. In this realm, like all realms, Swami Kripalu taught these mystical teachings that I talked about that are experienced at different levels, at different stages of the path. And when I first began the practice, the practical application of the practice was, for me, something that Swami Kripalu called love in the family. I had a distance relationship with my parents. I went to law school, but then, I became a legal aid attorney, and then eventually I became Kripalu Center's attorney. I practiced yoga. There were lots of ways that I was kind of a disappointment to them. They wanted me to be more, like my mother used to say, a senator, things like that.
Yes.
And, very successful in the world. And I was pursuing this, this thing to them that they didn't understand fully. So I was distanced from them. So, my first understanding of love was really being a caring person who could enter into the mindset of my parents and really try to create love in my own family. And that was a step on the path. And Swami Kripalu's teachings are very clear about the importance of having an emotional surround that is supportive. He says a yogi can't, practice in an environment in which there's enmity and, hard feelings and arguments. And so, the first thing a yogi needs to learn is to, create that emotional surround. And so, that led to, love with my parents, eventually, a loving relationship with my wife, and perhaps all of that was grounded in a self-acceptance and a loving relationship with myself. But as these teachings develop, you begin realizing these different levels. So that love that I just talked about, this is very understandable love. A good feeling for your parents, a good feeling for your wife, a good feeling for yourself. We all understand that. But how about the love that you feel, deep in your heart that you would call soul love? A love that wants to just spill over the banks of your river. That's a deeper level of love. That's a love that brings like a mystical communion with creation. That's a deeper teaching of love. And when you move into levels of samadhi and self-realization and the higher stages of yoga, you begin to see a really startling truth. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to express this in words so well, but I'm going to give it a try. You begin to see something that this whole universe could be described as an emanation of love into the field of time and space. I mean, this is like a cosmic thing. It's like this whole world with all its sufferings, with all its highs and all its lows, it's occurring in a field of energy that is loving, that exists to nurture the soul and to help the soul go on this transformative journey. That the most difficult, painful things, which are so evident in our world today, that they're occurring in a holding of divine love. So I've gone on that journey, and those deeper levels of love just change you. They and so I think that's why Swami Kripalu said, "I'm a pilgrim on the path of love from the most simple expression, the most caring decency to other human beings, to the highest love for God, to the love that is just reality at its core expression." And so the last thing is that love is primordial. So some people say consciousness, and some people say light. Some people say, the energy at the heart of existence. All of those things are true, but all of those things are also reflected in a cosmic love. So that's my best shot.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I don't have this quote of Swami Kripalu memorized either, but he said, when you have an experience of love, that stays with you always. And it's not always something that we can explain in words, but we always have that experience. And when we have that experience, then we become more equipped to be emissaries of love in the world, because we are reflecting this love without even really thinking about it, right? It's not like, okay, I'm going to start to reflect this love right this moment. It's just, we become love beings, right? We're doing that as we move throughout the world, and that's just such a beautiful gift that we can give the world when we're practicing, around these principles of love.
Swami Kripalu had one quote that said essentially that our deeper being is a lake of love. Sometimes he used a reservoir of love, or a wellspring of love.
Yeah.
So
even a fire, right? Like love can be a fire, a path of fire. It's like, it's a lot of different forms, but it's pretty powerful and pretty, there's no boundaries to it. So if love that you've described could speak through you in this moment, what would love say?
I think it would say something along the lines of, it is safe to feel, it is safe to heal, and it is safe to shine forth as your best and brightest soul self.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, Shobhan, for being with us today, for sharing. And let's all just put our hands on our hearts. And I want to really send love and gratitude to you for taking the time today, and for your offerings to the world and to this path around Swami Kripalu's teachings and the path of love. And just invite you to take a gentle breath, and let's all just notice like what stirred in us today, what softened. What did you notice shift in your awareness? If after this you want to do some journaling, maybe what is one quiet message from your heart that you will carry with you today? And until next time, may we all listen deeply and move gently and live from the heart. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Charlyn.
Gratitude.